the most developed nation in the world, falling apart at the seams. All over the country, there are signs of wear and tear. Sinkholes forming on dilapidated roads. Congestion on the highways. Delays on trains and at airports.
Well, America's infrastructure hasn't been maintained, and that's been true for 40 years. So it's like having the family car and never changing the oil. Eventually, it will not run, and that is what we're coming up on.
The most recent report by the American Society of Civil Engineers gives the US's infrastructure a grade of D+, meaning it's considered at risk. It says the amount of money needed to fix the country's roads is $2 trillion. Another $1 trillion is required to upgrade water pipes. And it will cost $123 billion to replace or repair defective bridges.
This bridge in Washington, D.C. is typical of the problem. It carries 70,000 vehicles a day and it looks okay. But experts say it's crumbling and should have been replaced nearly 2 decades ago. It's one of 56,000 bridges across the country that are classified as deficient.
A big increase in spending on infrastructure was one of Donald Trump's key election pledges. But there are fears that whatever is spent on it now simply won't be enough.
It's below mediocre. It is in no way fit for today or fit for the future. It will go from that to being simply failed.
But after 4 decades of underinvestment, at least America's infrastructure crisis is finally being addressed. John Brain, TRT World, Washington.
Well, for some more on this, our editor-at-large Craig Peters is in Paris. But first, let's speak to Henry Gruber. Now, he's in New York and is a staff writer for the website Slate, who's written exclusively on urban development. Henry Gruber, extensively, that should be, not exclusively. Henry, first of all, there's a lot of money at stake here, but who is going to pay for all this infrastructure planning?
Well, that's the big question right now. It's being advertised as a $1.5 trillion plan, but only $200 billion of that is coming from Washington. The rest is supposed to come from states, cities, and private sources. Even within that $200 billion, we don't know where that money's coming from. Some of it appears to come from cuts to the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency. So it's really not clear if there's very much new money at all going into this supposed $1.5 trillion plan.
And Craig, what do you make of this idea of trying to move money around and not fully funding the plans that the government actually wants?
Well, this is only a blueprint, but it's a pretty shoddy blueprint because whatever infrastructure they build, they're going to have to create a permanent revenue stream. And what's being missed here, if you look at the whole infrastructure deal, this $1.5 trillion doesn't include at all fixing things like fresh water systems that are now contaminated in the United States. Size and scope of that, EPA study in 2015 cited more than 5,000 water systems with serious health violations. 50% or more of those systems were in areas that served 500 people or fewer. And those are all rural areas, and they don't have that money Henry was talking about to kick into the pot.
And Henry, I'm glad you mentioned, sorry, Craig, I'm glad you mentioned the EPA because, Henry, one of the interesting parts of this is, of course, is Scott Pruitt in charge of the Environment Protection Agency, a guy who's sued that agency many times over the years, and the removal of regulations. Is that going to help push things forward, do you think, having all these regulations stripped away?
I think that's easier said than done. A lot of this stuff has been enshrined in legislation for decades, and while Trump can, to some extent, make it possible for projects to get greenlit faster, it's going to be very difficult for him to override some of the tenets of, say, this landmark environmental legislation from the 1970s. I think the larger question is whether or not this plan would bias spending towards places that have more money. I guess, this idea that rural areas can't afford to pay for this. This is also true of poorer urban areas. So the question is, if the projects under this plan are dependent on local spending, to what extent does that favor places where there's a lot of money locally?
And Craig, you start off by saying it's a really shoddy blueprint. Is there anything good to take from this? Do you think that the Trump administration is going to be able to push this through and get support for this infrastructure plan? Infrastructure was meant to be the thing that would get bipartisan support, wasn't it?
Well, given Donald Trump, I'll bet you $1.5 trillion that we're not talking about infrastructure at the end of this week. What this blueprint also fails to include is to consider the modern environmental design constraints that are required for any new infrastructure from the outset. You know, we don't know if you build the wrong thing at the wrong place at the wrong standards, you're going to have impact from environmental global warming over the years to come. Now, look at in 2017, the EPA you mentioned, the EPA, $280 billion, they said, just to adapt the roads and railways to the warmer climates that are coming to the U.S. And again, they're not including, at least at this point, what they call in the business proactive adaptation or preventive maintenance of these systems. It's expensive. Someone's got to pay for it.
Henry, just pick up on that, please, quickly, if you can. There's been some talk of perhaps raising tax on gasoline in the United States. Has that got any mileage in it?
Well, that's an idea that transportation and infrastructure advocates have been asking for decades. We have not raised the federal tax on gasoline in 25 years. Because cars have gotten more fuel efficient in that time, we're actually taking in less money from the tax now than we did 25 years ago, despite how much the country has grown since then. So I think there's actually pretty widespread support for raising the gasoline tax, but I think that the Republicans are reluctant to actually confront how much it would cost to pay for all this stuff, roads and rails and waterways. So raising the gasoline tax would be a huge, that would be a big start, and it would signal that they're serious about raising money for this rather than just moving paper around in Washington.
And final sort of thoughts to you, Craig. The Democrats themselves have come up with their own plan, which goes way further than this Republican plan and talks about $1 trillion of all federal money going into infrastructure. Do you think there's going to be some kind of middle ground that the two sides end up meeting on?
When it comes to cash flow, I don't see any middle ground. Call them tolls, taxes, or fees. The American public is going to have to pay. And as Henry pointed out, the American public doesn't like paying taxes, tolls, and fees. But someone's going to have to pay for it. And with tax cuts expected to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next decade, I have no clue where the government, state, federal, or local, are going to get it. You let private people come in and do it, then you are going to get tolls, taxes, and fees, because they're going to want to make a profit off of all this infrastructure, a big one.
Henry, pick up on that, the idea of private companies coming in. There was some back and forth between Trump and some of his advisors on the public-private partnerships that may well fund this infrastructure bill.
Yeah, I think that transportation advocates who want more money for infrastructure are not opposed to the idea of private funding. But the question again is who's bearing those costs and what type of projects does it favor? Big highway projects in wealthy urban areas might be able to fund maintenance with bridge tolls in, say, New York City. But if you're out in rural Oklahoma, no one's going to pay a toll to drive on the interstate out there. So this is, again, a solution that has pretty limited applicability and certainly not going to help, say, rebuild public schools in cities where the pipes are corroded with lead. So again, it's a potential solution. It's maybe part of the solution, but it's not broadly applicable.
Okay, gentlemen. Henry Gruber, staff writer for Slate, and Craig Peters, our editor-at-large in Paris. Thank you both for joining.